The Being an Engineer podcast is a repository for industry knowledge and a tool through which engineers learn about and connect with relevant companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. Enjoy the show.
What are the three most beautiful words in science? And the response was, I don't know. And I said, exactly. That's what drives science forward.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Being an Engineer podcast with your co-host Rafael Testai. Today we have another very special guest, Gerhard Pawelka. He's the co-founder of Cooper Perkins, part of PA Consulting. Previously, Gerhard was the CEO of Tune, creator of the Power Tap cycling computer, a company he co-founded after spending 9 years at IDEO. Many of you are familiar with IDEO, an international product design consultancy. Prior to Tune and IDEO, Gerhard was an engineer at Cannondale and earned a BS in mechanical engineering and an MA in international relationships. Gerhard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So we'd like to start out by asking you, how did you decide to become an engineer?
Well, that would suppose that I actually decided. I think I really just fell into it. Going into university, it seemed like a good place to start, and I thought I might drop into something else, but I didn't. I finished the course and did well enough at it, and got a job as an engineer. And I have to say, I really fell in love with engineering very soon after I started my first job at Cannondale as a designer.
Absolutely. We're going to dive right into the meat and potatoes here. What does honoring engineering mean?
Yeah, so that's a phrase that really kind of ties our group together. Early on, we didn't want Cooper Perkins to be kind of like like everybody rallies around the brand itself or the company or a flamboyant CEO. We really wanted to rally around the profession, and to us, it's a vocation, Latin of a calling, and so we really focused on defining our culture around engineering, and that sort of binds us all together, and it really says a lot about how we think of ourselves as a practice. Cooper Perkins is an engineering practice, much like attorneys might have a law practice or physicians might have a medical practice. It's a lifelong vocation that has us solving technical problems, and we're learning our craft, teaching our trade, and in doing so, practicing engineering. So that the phrase "honoring engineering," it's appended with the rest of it, which is learn it well, practice it honestly, teach it generously, and that phrase kind of binds us together and keeps us thinking about what's important to our professional lives.
Let's talk about that again. Learn it well, practice it
honestly, and teach it generously, and that really sums up what we do at Cooper Perkins. Part of now after a year, we're part of PA, and the company is also very much aligned with that phrase. But yeah, so we practice our trade, we solve technical problems, but in doing so, we're also always learning. And those who know about something and have something to give back, they're also teaching. So that's really kind of sums up what our professional experience is at Cooper Perkins. Practicing engineering, but learning it and teaching it as well.
Sometimes I like to dive too deep into the details, so let me know if I go too far. But the first statement, learn it well. How does one learn it well?
You become a student of it, a dedicated student. And I think a dedicated student is also a curious student. Curiosity is something that we find as a really important trait in our colleagues. It's sort of the fuel that makes people ask questions and kind of drives the scientific method forward in any kind of problem we're trying to solve or any kind of thing that we're trying to understand. So learning it well is driven by curiosity and just being a student of all aspects of engineering that you find are important to the way you want to solve problems.
Wonderful. About the second one, practice it honestly. How does one do that?
Yeah, that's an important one as well. We feel like with engineers, you have no choice but to be honest. Anytime you're coming across something that you kind of wish wasn't there, you can't sweep that under a carpet. You have to deal with it in a pretty honest way. And if you're dealing with a team, you got to, whether it's a client or a manager or the rest of your team or a subordinate, you got to speak the truth. When you don't, planes fall out of the sky and buildings fall over. You have to be honest about what you're looking at, how you're solving the problem. It's all going to be out there, and that's pretty critical. And I used to say that phrase quite a bit. Planes fall out of the sky. We have an example of just a few years ago where planes actually did fall out of the sky because somebody was being dishonest about the engineering, and it actually happens. And so we find that a pretty serious bit of our culture is honesty, transparency. It's a really important aspect for any engineer, I think.
I'm going to tie it all together. One of my favorite people on the internet to listen to is Jordan B. Peterson, and he talks about how responsibility breeds meaning in life. And I took one of my first engineering classes in college. Something that always stood out to me. I'm not the most eloquent person, so I'm probably going to butcher how I'm going to say this, but it all came down to society trusts engineers to do their work correctly. And there's like this implied trust when we drive over a bridge. We trust that the engineers did it correctly. We don't think about it twice. So it places a lot of responsibility on the engineers to take their job very seriously and do it honestly, like you say. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely true. I don't know if this is folklore or not, but there were building engineers or bridge designers that were kind of ceremoniously asked to stand underneath the bridge when the train first went over one of their creations. And it's not exactly the kind of incentive we want to have everybody subjected to. But it is. There is trust. A lot of our professional systems on the planet, including financial, they're based on trust and based that not only people are competent, but they're not engaged in some kind of criminal activity or being somehow dishonest. So it's trust is more than just being honest. It's also being having trust that somebody is competent and well trained. And I think that's really important when we're interviewing engineers to join our team. I'm principally focused on are they curious? Because somebody that has the confidence to say I don't know about something. Well, that's the fundamental part of the scientific method. I had a discussion recently with somebody saying, asking what are the three most beautiful words in science, and the response was, I don't know. And I said, exactly. That's what drives science forward, is when you don't know. And the only way you can answer those questions is to have a really honest approach. Like, I really don't know this, and I have to test this and find out what the answer is. And come what may, I'm not going to not have a bias on what the outcome might be. And I think that's fundamentally, we're trained to look at things in a very sober, honest way. We engineers, I should say, and there's sort of no other way to do it. If you're not being honest about what you see and what you observe and how you apply that knowledge, you're not really doing engineering. You're doing something else. So it's kind of really baked into the profession. When
you don't know something, do you have a process that you follow that you can teach us?
Absolutely.
What's the process like?
It's prototyping. here at Cooper Perkins, and certainly at with our partners, PA overall. It's a very prototype-driven culture, and let me explain what prototype-driven means. Prototypes to us is really anything that you can test. Now, when you think about that, you think, well, okay, does that include something you go into the mechanical shop and put on a lathe and a mill and make some piece of hardware? Sure, it's that. It's also a piece of code that you can try out and test. It's also a conversation you can have with an expert in a field. That is a prototype. It can be a bit of analysis. Anything that you can test an idea out with is a prototype, a spreadsheet, a piece of a question, a piece of text is a prototype. Years ago, when I was working at IDEO, there was a saying, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. And that's really true. The idea was never show up at a meeting without a prototype. And in a large sense of the word, it basically don't ever show up, in a meeting without something to test. So that's how we to get back to your question. If there's something you don't know, you can have a hypothesis or not, but either way, find a way to test your knowledge and triangulate and kind of bounce towards a conclusion. We set up all of our projects, everything that we do, as really tests. We're always making little mistakes and little corrections, and we always assume we're making little mistakes. That way, we're always poised to make little corrections, and that's how we converge on understanding something we don't know. We test it until we find what the answer is.
You mentioned having a conversation is a prototype, and I just kind of laughed a little bit in my mind because I could just imagine my name is Raf, so someone would say, "Hey Raf," and I'm say, "Just a second, I'm having a prototype with Bob over here," like a conversation. So it could be like synonymous, interchangeable. All right. So next subject, let's see. How do you deal with tough conversations with a client?
Yeah. So first, probably close to 100% of the time, tough conversations with anybody are not as tough as you imagine. Like they're kind of bigger in your mind than they actually are, or actually will be. So that's not, I'd say I've learned over time not to over dramatize a conversation that I need to have. The second thing is, again, honesty is a very common trait with engineers. And if you're honest, people appreciate that, and they'll take tough news usually better than you think. And it might take a few gulps and a few, uncomfortable moments, but generally people kind of get it all onto the same wavelength and say, okay, let's we've just adjusted my reality and now I'm in sync with your reality. Let's see what we can do next. And generally, people appreciate the honesty and appreciate, let's say, the opportunity to solve the next problem. And as I said, when I started to answer the question, generally people are not as, the conversation is not as tough as you make it out to be before you've had it. So I'd say go in there, have it, and things just generally work out. And almost all the time, everybody feels better. Okay,
let's talk again about IDEO. That's a place that a lot of designers and engineers wish that they could have worked at. It's very famous, IDEO, if anyone wants to go ahead and Google it. But we're not all going to get a chance to work there, and it's not meant for all of us. So if we had to pick up some of the key takeaways or golden nuggets from working at IDEO, in addition to the really good one that you already gave about never showing up to a meeting without a prototype, what are maybe like 3 or 4 other things that you learned as an engineer working at IDEO that you think other engineers would benefit from knowing?
Yeah, so I worked there in the 90s, and it was pretty hardcore product development, doing a lot of hardware at the time. We were doing, laptops. I mean, IDEO sort of, well, famous for a number of things, including designing the first modern laptop. Uh, I think that was by Grid. The the one of the real, how should I put it, attractive aspects of working in that group was before anybody had really figured it out in a world class way. IDEO had put together all of the aspects of product development, from user research to experience design to industrial design to electromechanical engineering, firmware development, really the wide range. And when you put a team with that kind of collective competency together to solve what seems to be an intractable problem, it's sort of a pretty magical thing that happens. And so back in the 90s when I was working there, it was a unique place to do that. It wasn't like there weren't a lot of places that do that. But now there are quite a few places that have that kind of full breadth of capabilities. Uh, I have to say, one thing we didn't talk about much was last year, PA, an outfit in the UK, acquired Cooper Perkins, and one of the things that I really loved about the idea of joining this group, and I love about it now, is we at PA now have this wide breadth of being able to solve business problems on a pretty wide scale, not just engineering and design and user research, user experience, but they're solving. I've got colleagues who are solving strategy problems for companies and um, operations problems, how to grow an organization or a market. So that sort of breadth of capability and this really uh, wide range of capabilities, not just across design and engineering, but across other business aspects, is really alluring and really a great thing to be part of. You asked me for three or four of them. I spent a lot on just that one.
It's okay. You can do one. That was a good one.
The other thing I'll say about a little more about prototyping is, this is something we did at IDEO, and I'd say it's very strong not only at Cooper Perkins but also at PA when we're solving problems. I look for people who figuratively are like polyglots. So Raf, when you're speaking with people who know several languages, you can tell that they're fluent when they're speaking in a way. Let's say they're thinking in the language that they're speaking, so they're not translating. If I'm thinking in Spanish, I can be more fluent than if I'm thinking in English and translating into Spanish. And that kind of fluency is figuratively what we look for in engineers and other people that we work with at not only Cooper Perkins but also at PA. So an example of this is an engineer might go into the workshop because they have to build something to understand what's in their head. So they build some prototype and they test it, and then they'll go over and write some Python code to simulate what they were thinking, and then they'll go over and do some finite element analysis to understand kind of what are the constraints and loads on this. Then they'll join their colleagues in a room to brainstorm some solutions to a problem, and very creatively and in a very highly creative and highly organized way collect a bunch of ideas to solve this problem. So that's what I mean by polyglots. You're able to kind of switch your thinking and your, so to speak, language. So when you're in a shop, you're thinking very different and speaking a very different language than when you're sitting in front of a computer doing writing some Python code, or when you're in a group of people creatively solving a problem. So we look for people who are polyglots like that. They can work in any of those environments and modulate between them in a very dynamic way. That's something that we find is really important. That was kind of how everybody at IDEO was defined, and that's certainly how we define our colleagues here at PA, Cooper Perkins.
Very interesting that you bring this up. This thought. What did you call it again? The capability of speaking different languages.
Well, the one who speaks multiple languages is called a polyglot. Not a very attractive word, but it is nonetheless a description of someone that can speak multiple languages. And I use that as a metaphor or an analogy for what I just described with engineering.
Great. Yeah, I had to. I never heard that word before, so polyglot. I just Googled it. Yeah, that's a very good thought. Not only you have to think in the different languages, but when you communicate it, I don't know about you, but when I speak Spanish and English, you speak a different. You also speak another language in addition to English, or no?
Yes.
Okay. What's the other language that you speak?
I would call it rusty German and rusty French.
Okay, but in Spanish and English, I use completely different muscles in my mouth when I speak them. So it's not only thinking differently, but also how the muscles that we use to communicate it are different.
True.
Well, I think this is a good time to mention to our listeners that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we can help build medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams. Sorry, I butchered that. Teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we can help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. I also wanted to mention to our valued listeners that we're doing a raffle of 5 $50 Amazon gift cards. If you simply give us a 5-star review in your platform of choice, we're trying to get to 100 ratings on various platforms for the podcast so more people can find us and learn. All right, so let's talk about what drew you into engineering. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you asked earlier, Raf, how I decided, and I said I kind of fell into it, and I learned to love it in my first job at Cannondale. It was an interesting experience. I was looking at working on a bicycle frame. So Cannondale had just started making these really innovative aluminum welded bicycle frames, and at the same time, I had read this article, about just how efficient these things are. I heard these stories about what an efficient mode of transportation bicycles are, and here I'm holding this 1 kilogram frame of welded aluminum tubes, and I thought, well, where does this come from? If you take the paint off, you just have welded tubes, and if you take the welds off, then you just have these tubes, and these tubes are shaped and mitered and swaged into whatever shape you want before you weld them. And before that, it was a hunk of aluminum alloy that hadn't been shaped into tubes yet. And before that, the aluminum alloy was just a number of different types of metal, principally aluminum, and aluminum comes from an iron ore called bauxite, and there's like a couple of processes, electrochemical processes that turn bauxite ore into aluminum. And before you take the bauxite ore into those processes, you find it in dirt that like in tropical dirt. You pick up a handful of dirt, and there's bauxite ore in that, and you take the bauxite out, and it goes through that whole process to turn into bicycle. And they had thought about this sort of like this story, like I've got a pile of dirt in one hand, and then I have the most efficient means of transportation ever conceived by humans. And that's what we do. We turn dirt into bicycles or spaceships or other things. And that I thought was kind of magical. That's what engineers do. They convert things that you find in the ground into some useful tool. We've been doing it for millions of years, whether it's taking a piece of stone and turning it into a blade to process game that you caught, or building a spaceship that goes to Mars. It's really finding stuff it's really taking stuff you find in the ground and shaping it into some useful tool. So that's how I kind of regarded engineering from an early age. When I first started my work as an engineer, I thought, like, we're magicians taking stuff you find in the ground and turning them into useful tools. I've been doing it ever since, and that's sort of how I think about engineering.
It's like, it reminds me of like finding a diamond in the rough, or I share the sentiment of engineering, very passionate about it. Well, when I'm having a conversation, sometimes questions just seem to pop up in my head. And this is a question I had from one of the initial topics that we discussed, which was, you talked about teaching it generously. Could you give us do you have examples or like a process in which everyone teaches internally at Cooper Perkins?
Yeah, it's the projects we work on. Often they're projects, we don't know what the answers are. We have to find them, and so we're often learning. It's rare that we're just kind of on a project where we're turning the crank, doing things that we've done before. Almost always we're in a position that we have to learn something. We'll tell our partners, our clients, this as well, saying, look, we don't exactly know how to do this, but here's what we're going to propose to do, and here's how we propose to find this answer. Generally, it's okay. We trust you. Go and do this. So there's the very nature of the work is that we have to learn something. Your question was also about teaching, and so it's very common that somebody on our team, with all of our colleagues that we work with, even colleagues outside of our company, Cooper Perkins or PA, will ask a question like, have you ever done such and such before, or have you seen this, or does this make sense to you? Yes, I do have some experience with this, and I do have some insights, and let me tell you about them. And that communication is teaching. You're imparting your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge in a very kind of applicable way to someone else, and that's what we're doing. And that can be very, how should I put it, tractable and very explicit, but it can also be more tacit in that you might not be teaching somebody, here's the answer to your problem, but here's how you might go about getting an answer to your problem. Like, use this process or this methodology, and that process will lead you to the answer. I don't know what the answer is, but here's a tool you can use to get to the answer.
I sense an underlying theme of being comfortable with the unknown throughout the whole process. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's I think the fundamental, well caught, Raf. It's sort of the fundamental way of being for us, because we're always putting ourselves in a position of having to figure something out, and it basically exercises that curiosity muscle, which we like to think is, let's say, pretty active one in all of us. We look for people who are curious, and I like working with people who are curious about everything, because they're always kind of moving in a way that converts something that is unknown or something that is believed into something that is known. And curiosity is a machine that consumes beliefs and uncertainty into certainty. And I think there's something very attractive about that.
All right. So we're getting close to the end of the podcast, just about getting ready to wrap up. And I just have two questions left. You're a co-founder, someone that started a company. So the skill sets and your interests, all of our skill sets and interests differ from one another. But I wanted to ask you, if you had to make a Venn diagram of your three most important skills, the three areas that you really excel at, one of them would be obviously engineering, but what would you say are the other two things in your Venn diagram?
I think my ability to communicate uh, effectively is an important part of my uh, uh, being. Being able to simplify concepts and communicate them is important, really, in any kind of business that I know of. That's and engineering is no exception. The other part is, I think it might come from just being a parent or being old. Is I really care about people's experiences. So when I'm working with my colleagues, I care about what they're learning. I care about what they're doing and how they're developing their careers and how they're experiencing engineering, and hopefully in a way that is as rewarding as it was for me. I think as far as being a leader or somebody that organizes a company, being technically competent in whatever field you're in, being able to communicate. Um, Second part of that Venn or that circle of your Venn diagram. And the third is really, caring about the people you work with. You can't get away from that. That's that's a big. I'd say that's a big circle in your Venn diagram.
How do you show people that you care?
I don't know. I don't really. I don't really think about it. I don't think about it. It's just something that comes out, and I think once you're working in a tight team, that just people just gravitate, like people go there anyway. When you become part of a team and it's a good team and it's a team you care a lot about and the team cares a lot about you, that just happens, and people get to know each other, and people get to really start thinking a lot about other people's experience. So I think it just sort of happens if you're equipped in that way. And it's remember the honor engineering: learn it well, practice it honestly, teach it generously. Uh, Generous is another key word here, and being there to teach it generously, that means you care about what you're teaching and who you're teaching, and that's every one of those words in that phrase goes to not only what we're about at Cooper Perkins, but we're about it at PA. And I think beyond that, what our clients are about, working with smart people who care to, practice whatever they're doing honestly, and recognizing we're always learning, and recognizing that we're generous in teaching each other what we're doing. I think it makes kind of a good work experience, whether you're a little company like Cooper Perkins, or a bigger company like PA, or a bigger company like one of our many clients. That's that phrase applies.
I think that the word caring, it's a key trait for leadership because it develops trust. And it reminds me of Aaron Munker, the founder of Pipeline. I think that everyone that Pipeline who sponsors this podcast, everyone that works at Pipeline, we honestly feel like Aaron cares. And I think that's a good leadership trait. Well, yeah, go ahead. If you want to add any last remarks.
Yeah, it's I sent a short text to one of my colleagues who's a veteran a few weeks ago on Veterans Day, just saying something about admiring people who serve things that are bigger than themselves. And I think that's where caring about what you do and caring about what experiences your colleagues have is you're serving something bigger than yourself. And if you're an employee at a company, if you care about your team or you care about your company, you're serving something bigger than yourself. It just sort of comes naturally. And I think that's a very, very rewarding thing. And as I mentioned, that colleague who's a veteran, he knows what it's like to serve for multiple years for something bigger than himself. And I think, as I said, it's rewarding, and it just kind of brings the best out in people. And it's the same at a little engineering firm, or a big consultancy, or a big company, and many other institutions.
Well, Gerhard, I really appreciate being on the podcast. I appreciate this conversation we had about engineering, caring, leadership, best practices. Any last words for our audience, and how can they find you?
You can find us, Cooper Perkins, on a website. Just type in Cooper Perkins, and you'll find us. PA Consulting is our parent company, and you'll find them pretty easily. Lots of cool stories. If you're interested to find out more, give us a call, but poke around on the website. We have tons of great stories we were lucky enough to be part of, and happy to talk engineering or anything related to engineering anytime. Happy to hear from you.
All right. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks. Pleasure.
I'm Aaron Monker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.